But tonight, we're going to look at Elementor Forms, but not as a feature tour. I'm over feature tours for those. The useful question, I think, for freelancers is when are Elementor Forms generally good enough for the job? So that's kind of how I'll be framing tonight's talk. Because in real world projects, form requests often sound simple. A client can say, can you just add a form? And sometimes that really does mean just a basic contact form. But sometimes it can quietly include things like email delivery, CRM integration, follow-up automation, payments, all that kind of complex stuff. And those are very different responsibilities. So tonight, we'll look at Elementor Forms through that particular project lens. Where are they a good fit? Where do they need a little bit more scoping? And where has the request probably become, when does it become a workflow that needs a completely entire different system? So the main idea, main concept for tonight is pretty simple. A form is not just the fields on a page, it's also what happens next. You'll have to excuse me for my coughing, just recovering from the flu. I'll try and remember to mute my audio if I'm doing some coughing. Okay, so this is the phrase that gets freelancers in trouble. Can you just add a form? It sounds small, and sometimes it is, but lots of different requirements can arrive disguised as just a form. A contact form is a form. A quote request is a form. A lead magnet is a form. Membership application, course enrollment, they're all forms, but they're not the same kind of responsibility as just a form. A form might be simply send an email. A lead magnet might need CRM, email delivery, thank you page, tracking follow-up. A membership application might involve approval, payment, onboarding, access control, all that sort of stuff. So the trap is really for freelancers, it's quoting for the kind of visible part of the form, because a lot of people jump there first. A lot of freelancers jump there first. So the visible part of the form, the number of fields that you need to add, that sort of stuff. But the hidden part is all that workflow behind it. So before choosing Elementor Forms, we need to ask a question. Is this just collecting information, or is it starting a whole new business process? So instead of starting with the tool, let's start with the better question, which is what actually needs to happen after someone clicks on the submit button, because that's what it's all about when we're dealing with forms. So the main question I normally ask before choosing any type of form tool, regardless whether we're sitting in the elementary ecosphere or not, it's not can this form, Gravity Forms or Elementor, or can this form do this? It's I always ask the clients what happens after they click that big submit button. If the answer is the client receives an email and maybe the submission is saved, then that's usually fine. That's comfortable Elementor Forms use case, that's no problem. But if the answer becomes something like, well, it needs to update the CRM, it needs to tag the lead person in the project, it needs to send different emails, notify different people, create a task, maybe trigger some automation. Now we're dealing with a complete chain of responsibility. It's no longer just a simple form. And that matters because field count doesn't always equal complexity. I know a lot of freelancers like to package up things like number of pages on a site, $500 for 5 pages, that sort of thing. I will include 2 forms, and those 2 forms can have, 4 different fields in a submit form. That's one way that freelancers approach it. I tend to approach it more from, well, what happens after you click the submit button to kind of scope what that form, adding a simple form actually means. Now, a 10-field contact form, it might be super simple. It might just click those fields, save it, and that's it. But conversely, a 3-field membership inquiry might be risky if it starts things like an approval, onboarding, payment, and access workflow. So this question, what happens after submit, kind of shifts us from the front end view to more of the project and workflow view. So what's being collected? Where does it go? Who needs to act on it? Who owns it? What happens if it fails? So those are the real requirement, and that's where the real requirements usually live. It's this kind of back end workflow system, and not kind of designing or styling the form that might come into some freelancers' heads when they first think or get proposed from the client that says, we need to add a form. So once we ask that question, what happens after submit? Then we can start to see if Elementor Forms is a good fit or not. So let's define this kind of comfort zone first. Elementor Forms are generally useful. I use them a lot in projects. For many client websites, they're exactly the right tool. One of the reasons I like using Elementor Forms, if I'm building a site in Elementor, it's part of that ecosystem. It looks the same, it acts the same, it integrates with all the other widgets, so it makes sense to use that rather than install another system and having to bash that in and have another yet different area for the client to get used to. So the comfort zone really is things like collect, notify, store, and redirect. That's just very, very simple, use case for using Elementor Forms. So the fields collect the visitor's details, the website notifies the right person, the submission is stored if needed, and then the visitor gets a confirmation or a thank you page. And that pattern covers a lot of different client work, general contact forms, quote requests, callback forms, simple inquiries, lead capture, basic download requests even. In these cases, the submission mostly completes that interaction. So once you've submitted, then that's it done. The form's job is done, and everyone's happy, the client's happy, the person filling out the form is happy, and that's the end of that use case. Now, that's very different from a form that needs to make things like decisions, manage access, take payment, create records, or run some sort of longer workflow. So when I say Elementor Forms are enough, this is usually the kind of pattern I'm looking for, these kind of general contact forms, quote requests, that sort of thing. I'll be happy to say, yep, okay, we just collect information, it passes it to the client, to the recipient, and that's it. That's the end of the process. That's fine. Elementor is good enough for that. But when we're talking about that, simple doesn't mean careless, though. So even though you've got these comfortable, simple forms that we can implement, you still need to do things like test and email delivery, checking the saved submissions, making sure the confirmation and thank you message is correct, and make sure the client knows where that query goes, if it's to a particular email address or inbox or something like that. So Elementor Forms are good. It's a good fit when the job is to collect, notify, store, and redirect. But even in that comfort zone, even when that's a simple form, there's one practical issue that catches a lot of projects out, and that's email delivery. So let's have a look at that next. A successful form submission is not the same as a successful business outcome. A lot of freelancers get those ones mixed up. The visitor might see a success message. Elementor might record the submission and everything might look as if it worked. But if the client never receives the inquiry, then the form has kind of failed from a business point of view. And that's why even simple forms need professional handling. So before handover, we want to test the full path, even for simple forms. Submit the form, check the admin notification, check the visitor confirmation if there is one, check the reply to address that we can reply to those forms. The client can reply to the contact person. Check that the saved submissions are there. Check the thank you message, confirmation message, or the redirect works. And make sure the client knows what happens after someone submits so they can go to the right place and be checking that on a constant basis. A simple client note can prevent a lot of customer confusion later on. So even if it's something simple as you tell the client, this form sends to this particular email address, submissions are stored here, and this person is responsible for replying. Those things can really go a long way, especially if you've got multiple these forms set up within a website. Just letting the customer know exactly what's going on is a really good thing to do. Because if the client says, we haven't had any inquiries, you need to know if you're maintaining the website, whether that means no submissions, or the emails failed, or no one's checked the right place where the emails are actually going to. So that's not just a form issue, that's more of a kind of workflow ownership. So with that foundation in place, let's start with the easiest scenario, which is a basic contact form. So this is the cleanest example of a form that you can have. Basic contact form, usually a very good fit for Elementor Forms. The visitor enters the name, email, probably a message. The business receives a notification. Visitor gets a confirmation. Submission may also be saved inside WordPress or Elementor in the submissions folder. Now that sits comfortably in the Elementor Forms comfort zone. That's what it's good at doing. You're not creating a user account. You're not managing payments or processing an application. Nobody's getting enrolled in any course. You're simply collecting an inquiry and then passing it to the business. But the basics still matter. You still need to do things like thinking about adding spam protection, sending notifications to the right address, set the reply to correctly, check the submissions, and just test the form before we hand it over to the client. But Elementor Forms in this context are usually enough here. Just don't confuse simple with unimportant. All forms are important, especially in a single contact form, because that's usually, if a client is asking for a business website, that's usually the main conduit where leads are coming in. So a contact form is usually the easy yes for Elementor Forms. But the next scenario is where the form still looks simple, while the workflow just starts to expand that little bit more. So let's look at a lead magnet form. Now, this type of form often looks simple. So again, you might have a name and email, maybe a consent checkbox, and then a button to download something. Elementor Forms still may be a good fit here, but the form is not always the whole job. The real question, again, is what happens after that lead is captured. So it might be a simple process where it just sends you a link, or it sends you a thank you page with a download link, something like that. But you've got to think about what the process is. Do they get redirected to the download page? Is a PDF emailed? Are they added to email platform or CRM? Is consent required? So example, in EU, they need to have a consent form for that, consent checkbox. There might be legal terms and conditions as well that people would need to check. Does the client need conversion tracking for that? And is there a follow-up sequence that happens? So none of that automatically rules Elementor Forms out, but it does affect the scope of how you approach implementing a form on a client website. A simple lead magnet can still be fine. It can do the simple job ever. But once the client wants things like tagging, segmentation, sales, different follow-ups depending on different choices, now you're kind of quoting for a small marketing workflow rather than just implementing a simple form. So lead magnets are really complex because of the fields. They can be really simple fields, but they become complex because of this kind of follow-up. What happens after somebody engages with the lead magnet? So a lead magnet is often still a good fit for Elementor Forms, but that follow-up needs to be scoped. Now let's move on to another common client request, so quote requests and project inquiries. These types of forms, very common, and Elementor Forms still are often a very good fit for this. So the form captures details, it might ask qualifying questions, notifies the business, stores the submission, sends a visitor to a thank you page or redirect page. That's all reasonable. But these types of quote forms, project forms, they can quietly expand into things like maybe the client wants different inquiries sent to different people, depending on what you're looking for. So this could be a good example from a project application, depending on what type of services that are clicked on. It might send it to different people or different inboxes. For example, you might need a website redesign, or what happens if you need some SEO services as well. You might want that going to your SEO person, that sort of stuff. You might want to capture uploads. So, for example, we engaged with a tiler last year. We had the tiles come up on our back veranda. And again, this person is looking, can you kind of send some examples of what's happening, a rough area of the size. So they had a file upload in their contact form, which again just increases that complexity. They may want urgent requests flagged. So if you're asking for a project or a quote on something, the client might want to know how urgent is that? Can it wait for a couple of months? Does it need to be done right now? It's my roof leaking, that sort of stuff. So urgent requests might want to be flagged. You might want to estimate pricing, which means gathering a whole lot of extra data. And again, we kind of might move into the more complexity. So once the quote is submitted, you might want that deal added to a CRM. They might want different follow-ups depending on what type of inquiry it is as well. So at that point, the form is doing more than just collecting the information. It's actually helping run part of the entire sales process. And that doesn't automatically make Elementor Forms wrong, but it does mean that the requirement needs really, really good, proper scoping in order to determine if Elementor Forms is still a good fit or we need to bring in something bigger and heavier. So the key question here is this form just collecting an inquiry, or is it helping run a sales process, an automation process? That answer really affects the tool that we're going to use. It also affects the testing, the handover, and the price as well, because you're no longer just implementing a capture form. You're now starting to look into automation and integration with other systems as well. So quote request forms are still often a good fit, as long as we scope the decisions very carefully and understand what information is being captured and what happens after the submit. But the next step up is usually where maintainability really starts to matter. And these are things like multi-step application forms. So this is where we kind of move away from the green, good Elementor is a good fit. Yep, no easy to implement type of territory, more into the kind of amber territory that kind of could go either way. Multi-step application forms, they might still be a fit for Elementor, and Elementor does support multi-step. If the form is simply broken into clear steps, maybe for usability, that can be a good experience. So things like if someone's asking for personal details, maybe there's a grant application. So you got your personal details, you got your grant details, you got support information where you upload stuff, and then I kind of review and submit. That's still fine. That could be a good fit for Elementor. It can do all that sort of stuff. So the issue here is not really whether the form can be built. The issue, again, is whether it stays maintainable. So how many steps are there? Are there conditional fields that would then show a step or a different step? Are uploads involved? Because that always increases complexity when you mention uploads. Does the client expect partial saves, for example? Can someone save it and then go away and come back later on? Again, complexity. Do different answers trigger different notifications? Again, are we connected to CRM? But also, will the client need to edit it later? That's quite often the case. Whereas if an organization might have, say, a grants application, they might want to capture different information in different years, so that might grow and evolve. So the big question really is, can someone safely change this from form 6 months later without breaking the entire workflow? So if the logic is simple, testable and documentable, Elementor Forms might be quite enough for this multi-step application form. If it starts to feel like a small application, you may need to think about specializing into a different form plugin or a different workflow system. So again, this whole scoping, understanding what happens throughout the process and after the submit, and scoping out that it really kind of determines what type of system you're going for. Is it still the Elementor Forms? Are they still okay? Or are you going to need to bring in something with a bit more weight, a bit more application hooks, a bit more meat, so that you can then implement this kind of extra workflow on the end? So multi-step application forms are possible. Elementor Forms can handle that. But you need to think about things like maintainability. That can become a deciding factor as to which one we need to use. The next scenario is where the wording matters a lot, and that's a membership application. So I do a lot of these. I do a lot of membership sites. I work a lot with organizations, and they've always got membership applications, whether it's a simple application or whether it's enrollment into an LMS or something. These type of applications are a good boundary example because the wording as to how the client approaches you for this type of form can hide the kind of real requirement behind it. So a simple membership application might just collect details for then someone to review it manually. In that case, Elementor Forms may just be fine. So the form collects the application, organization reviews it, someone follows up, and maybe the member ends up added later manually to whatever member system. I've certainly implemented a lot of those. A lot of the organizations I work with still have very old workflows. They deal with spreadsheets. They might have a bespoke system, membership system that somebody knows inside and out that cannot be integrated, and that's fine. So this Elementor Forms will work really well in this scenario by collecting information and then somebody else actions it manually. Again, that type of really simple form where you collect information, press submit, and that's it. That's the end of the process, rather than going into kind of whole workflow. So this is where you need to be careful. If the client expects the form to create things like user accounts, approve or reject members, take payment, assign membership levels, restrict content, onboarding, all that sort of stuff, that is no longer just a form. That's a whole membership system. And you have to be careful the way that client words these things, because just adding a membership form can also mean all these things as well. So it could move into like a whole membership system that you need to look after. So the practical distinction is this form just collecting data, or is it starting to manage a whole membership? Membership applications show how quickly a form can become an entire system in its own right. I've been there. I've had a client who just wanted, membership application, and then suddenly we're looking at, creating user profiles in the back end, and then once a user profile has been created, well, now the member needs to update that user profile next year because they've moved on, they've changed the email. So it can quickly turn away from just an application form into like a full-blown membership system. So be very careful. And this is definitely in the kind of amber red zone for Elementor Forms. The last one I want to talk about is course enrollment. It's got a very similar boundary. Courses, membership systems, they've got a lot of common features and functionality in it. So the client may say, we need a course enrollment form. But we have to ask them and determine exactly what they mean by that. So they might mean pre-boarding, pre-information, or they could mean the actual course enrollment. So if someone is requesting course information, maybe they're joining a waitlist, downloading an onboarding brochure, asking which course is right for them, then yeah, sure, Elementor Forms might be fine. Because again, we're collecting information, they're submitting, that's usually kind of the end of the process where someone will then manually action something, or they might just get a free download. Elementor Forms, nice and easy. That's simple for them to implement that. This is the pre-enrollment type part of course enrollment, where the form is actually kind of on the edge of the workflow. These are people kind of just probing at the corners. Is this right for me? Can I be on a wait list? Can I get some information? Elementor, fantastic for that stuff. The actual enrollment usually involves an awful lot more. Now we're talking about things like student accounts, payments, course access, onboarding emails, progress tracking, certificates, refunds, cancellations, all that sort of stuff. That's no longer just a form problem. That's an LMS, learning management system. It's a full-blown membership system. We're talking about checkout systems, probably CRM integration, automation workflows with emails being sent out, all that sort of stuff. So that's very, very different. So when a client says, we need a course enrollment form, you really need to scope and understand, is that just pre-enrollment collection, or are they actually looking for like a whole course automation onboarding system? So certainly my rule here is use Elementor Forms before enrollment, sure, but don't make them responsible for the whole enrollment system. I've dealt with systems where freelancers have tried to go down that path and create their own functions and try and kind of create the semi-course enrollment that links in with some other course system. It never works out well. It's always good just to take the system that deals with the course and run with that, and have Elementor kind of on that boundary area to collect information. So now we have a few good examples. I've got contact forms, lead magnets, quote requests, applications, membership, course enrollments. So we've kind of seen where Elementor might fit in those, which is an easy decision, like kind of the green. We've seen kind of amber cases where it might be a good fit. And then we've seen kind of red scenarios where probably Elementor Forms is not the best choice to implement that. So let's turn that into a kind of simple decision model that freelancers can use during discovery or just a general chat with clients. So here's a simple model. It's not very perfect. It's not very technical, but it is practical. So when a client asks for a form, you can really quickly think about it in 3 zones. So green, amber, and red. I like using traffic light stuff. It makes sense for me. So green is where Elementor Forms are usually enough. This is what we call the comfort zone we defined earlier. So the form collects information, notifies the business, stores the submissions if needed, and then redirects or confirms the submission afterwards. Nice and easy. Elementor Forms can do that. And it covers a lot of normal client website work that you get involved in. Things like contact forms, simple inquiry forms, callback requests, basic quote forms, simple lead captures, easy as. So the form here is not trying to run the whole business process. It's simply collecting information and handling it to the right place. Amber is where Elementor Forms may still be good enough, but you kind of need to pause and see exactly what's going on here. So this is where the form starts doing more than basic collection. So it might need to send data somewhere else, somewhere outside WordPress, and things like a CRM integration, an email system. The form might start including conditional logic. So maybe depending on which services is being chosen, it might ask you different questions and then email it to a different place. It might have file uploads again. That really is a complex issue. I know it sounds simple. The client may say, oh, we need the client to upload, a couple of pictures. Sounds easy, but when you're actually doing the complexity in the back end, what does that mean? What are they uploading? What can you upload? What's the storage? What about privacy? What if the uploads like the passport details or something? That can all be very, very complex. So file uploads definitely like amber territory. Again, we talked about multi-step forms. We talked about automation as well. So if it's going into an automation system, maybe Elementor Forms is not the right system for that. It could be, but it might not be. It might route inquiries differently depending on all the different answers. So all these kind of areas, Elementor Forms still might be a good choice, but you need to kind of pause and think and scope. See, is it really enough for what the client needs? Not just now, but maybe in 6 months or a year's time as well. So the amber zone, the answer isn't automatically no, don't use Elementor Forms, but it's also no longer automatically yes. This is kind of where you need to scope carefully. You need to test properly. You need to document what happens as well. It's very, when you start getting these complex workflows, it's really good to document it so the client understands this form on this page, this is what happens. So they're not coming back to you with support requests, all that sort of stuff. And you may need to explain to the client that the complexity is not the form itself, but the behavior around the form. So collecting the data might be fairly easy. You might be able to spin up a 5-step form really quickly, but what happens after, they press submit, that's a complex process. You need to maybe tell the customer, this is why it's costing more, this is why it's taking longer. The red zone is where Elementor Forms are probably not good enough as the main system. So this is where the form is expected to process, manage things over time. So things like memberships, course enrollments, payments, profile updates, user accounts, renewals, access control, structured records, all that kind of ongoing stuff, admin workflows. That's probably not a good choice for Elementor because you're having to then automate all that stuff and implement stuff yourself. Whereas looking to another system like an LMS or a membership system, that's usually all integrated with the forms, which works nicely within that system that you're trying to work with. So at
Can
that
I
point,
say, can I say something?
uh, yeah,
I've just been working with my client in Los Angeles and he was like keen on HubSpot. Have you heard of HubSpot?
yeah, I know HubSpot, yeah,
Yeah, so I integrated that system in, which was quite interesting because once you start doing forms on Elementor, it takes all that information and stores it into the HubSpot, which you can use for all that other management, for customer retention and things like that.
yeah,
So yeah, I just wanted to say that that's what I found interesting about it.
yeah. No, that's great. Yep, thank you for that. So that's kind of my simple traffic light. Green, Elementor is good to go. Amber, a little bit careful. Red, probably not. So the useful thing about this model is it kind of gives you language as well during discovery. So instead of saying, "Oh, Elementor Forms can't do that," which is a negative thing, you don't want to tell customers that that can't be done because they'll start looking elsewhere. Instead of saying that, you can say things like, well, this has moved from a simple form into a workflow process. So we need to decide what system should own that workflow. So we're not telling the client we can't do that. We're telling the client that this is more complex than maybe they initially thought, and we need to have a look at that. Um, so that kind of protects your quote if you are working with clients, because green zone forms can often be really quick and efficient. Amber zone forms kind of need more scoping, testing, documentation, and red zone forms, they need completely more scoping, testing, usually a dedicated solution, not a clever workaround where you're adding code hacks just to try and make it bend to what it wants to do. So once you have that model in your head, the next step is knowing what question to ask before you go and choose which tool is right for the implementation. This doesn't have to be a long discovery workshop. Sometimes a 5-minute conversation with the client. It's just asking better questions. Here are my 5 questions. So whenever forms come up in a project, first question I ask is what happens after submit? We covered that early on. So does the submission end that interaction or does it start a new process, a new workflow? We need to know that. The second question is who owns that data? So is it just a message or is it the customer? Is it a member? Is it a student? Is it an applicant? Is it a sales record? So what data is created and who owns that afterwards? Question number 3 is, does the form need to make decisions? So are we talking about routing? Are we talking about conditional fields? Different notifications, calculations, automation, all that kind of stuff. They definitely need to understand that. The fourth question is who has to maintain it? If the client needs to edit it later, then your simplicity in that workflow really does matter. If the client's going to edit it, you need to ensure that that workflow still works, the form doesn't break, and all that stuff that's connected to it still works for that. Again, if you're in a red zone, then that's probably going to be a more complex implementation. You need to be kind of careful with that. Who's going to maintain that? It might be yourself as an ongoing contract for that. Fifth question is what happens if it fails? Now, we've not really covered a lot of that tonight, but things like, for business cases, if the email doesn't arrive, if the CRM doesn't get updated, or maybe the wrong person is notified, who catches that? Who looks after that? Who deals with that? Yeah, that kind of process. So it's really important just to think about what's happening with these 5 questions. It gives you a clearer idea of the scope as to what we need to implement, other things we need to think about as well. If all these answers are simple, then Elementor Forms, yep, usually a great fit for that. But if answers are more complex, then we need to kind of more scope the workflow before you even go and touch any type of builder or decide on what sort of form system. So those questions, they don't just affect the build, They also affect the quote because a lot of freelancers underquote forms. As we talked before, a lot of them will price by the number of fields or the number of forms instead of the responsibility, the workflow, and complexity that's actually involved. So a lot of people, a lot of freelancers quote on the visible work. So how many fields, how many steps, how long will it take to style this form? But the real work, the real stuff, the real cost often sits around the form. So notifications, confirmation emails, thank you pages, CRM integration, automation tracking, testing, documentation, client handover, and then support after launch. A lot of freelancers miss all those steps, but it's really important because if you don't include that, then you're basically doing a lot of extra work for free. So that's the responsibility around the forms and not just designing the forms. So a lead magnet connected to an email platform is not just one form, it's a small marketing workflow. And clients need to understand that. And they'll appreciate being understood that it's more than just a form on a website. A quote form with uploads, routing, CRM, deal creation, well, that's part of a sales process, and that requires a lot more scoping and workflow and complexity. And again, we talked about LMS course membership, applications, approvals, payment access, onboarding. That's a whole system requirement. So we've moved away from Elementor and just a form into more of this is a complete ecosystem, a complete system. It needs to be set up and configured and delivered. So instead of quoting the form, quote what the form is responsible for. Useful client language here is things like saying the form itself is simple, but the workflow behind it is what needs planning and testing and documentation and implementation. So that really helps explain as well when you're doing a quote for a client where the cost is involved. So not just based on the number of fields and the visual stuff that they can see on the page, but all that complexity that surrounds what happens after that submit button is finished. Okay, so let's bring this back to the main question that we started with. This is the main takeaway. Elementor forms are often enough when the submission completes the job. So when someone fills out the form, the business is notified, submission is saved, visitor gets confirmation, and then the client follows up. Elementor forms really, really good for that. That's a good practical use of Elementor forms. When the submission starts a job or a workflow, that's time to pause and just think a little bit more clarity, because now the form may be carrying more responsibility. It may be starting a sales process, feeding a CRM, triggering some automation, collecting applications, payments, creating records, handling all that sort of stuff, different access. So the better question is not, can Elementor Forms do this? The better question to ask when you're scoping stuff, it might be your own stuff, might be client stuff, is what responsibility does this form carry? So that shift kind of changes how we scope, quote, test, document, and support that kind of whole project. So next time client says, can you just add a form? The professional response is sure, but let's quickly map what needs to happen after someone submits it. So just to close, Elementor forms are not just about what the visitor fills in. They're about what the business needs to happen next after that submit button is pushed. Okay, I'll move into Q&A. I'll just post some stuff into the chat here. So what I've posted there is 3 links. First link is the Elementor free changelog. The second link is Elementor Pro changelog. And then there's a developer update as well on the Elementor website. It's always good to know what's happening with Elementor, with the free one, what's coming up in the future, what kind of dev things have changed as well. So those links are really good just to keep an eye, maybe every 2-3 months, every quarter. And I'll pop some questions. We don't have to answer these questions, but just kind of some discussion questions if you want to. So things like, what is one form request that you would now scope differently? What happens after submit on some of your most common client forms? Are they just collecting information or do they start big workflows? And which part causes more support for you? Is it the form? Is it the email or is it like the integrations that you're dealing with those? Okay, I'm going to stop my share here.